All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us today for today's webinar, Momentum, UEDA and Economic Development Ecosystems. It's presented in partnership as a result of some funding we received at UEDA from the Lemelson Foundation as we explored work with ecosystems, and we'll hear more about that in a few minutes. But first, just a few housekeeping items. If you do have any questions, please use the Q&A function that is in the Zoom panel that we've all been very familiar with these days. If for some reason you're having any technical difficulties, you can use the chat function and chat directly with me. Everyone today is going to be on mute, except for our presenters, and we are recording today's webinar, and it will be posted to the UEDA YouTube channel here in the next few days. Just a little brief intro on the University Economic Development Association. What we do is we connect members, our members, which consist of higher education institutions, private sector businesses, and economic development organizations to resources that help facilitate economic growth within their communities. UEDA members represent those who are on the cutting edge of modern economic development. As we all know, the 21st century economy has evolved into an entity that behaves much differently than its predecessors, especially now in a post-pandemic world. So attracting established industry to your town is no longer a reliable route to prosperity. And we need to be talking about innovation and entrepreneurship. We need to be fostering talent in young people from preschool all the way through life to embolden them and think and create outside the traditional academic and professional requirements. And it's about creating these environments that attract those people that want to make and do things in new ways and retains the talent to then start that process all over again with the next generation. So we're in a very important stage in our economy, and everyone here on this call is committed to this recovery and doing amazing work. And our field of practice in UEDA helps to support that work. So if you are not a member and feel compelled to do so, to learn more, feel free to reach out to me directly. My name is Tim Hines. I'm the Executive Director of UEDA. I'm happy to have a conversation with you about how it can work for your organization or institution. You can also find more at our website, universityeda.org. Now, I mentioned that this project was funded in part with a grant from the Lemelson Foundation. UEDA has really steadily worked to increase the awareness of the roles, resources, and players in regional ecosystems, and that's transcends the educational world as well as entrepreneurship and even inventions. Expanding on this initial work that Lemelson has done in ecosystems, UEDA is now leading the intentional process, which we're going to hear about today, of making regional ecosystems more sustainable, helping ecosystems and their individual participants determine best practices, and also define distinct roles and contributions that allow them to adapt based on dynamic changes within their region, which we're all seeing. So each ecosystem faces unique challenges and gaps, but there are shared difficulties and teachable strategies that help to strengthen those regional ecosystems and, by extension, national ecosystems and systems of change. The Ecosystem Design Network offers access to resources, cross-ecosystem collaboration opportunities, and technical assistance regarding strategic partners, building funding access, and much more. So there is more information on our website, universityeda.org/ecosystems. You can find more information there. You can register your ecosystem. You can consider membership as an ecosystem in UEDA and consider participation in the UEDA Ecosystems Design Network. And I'm very thrilled to welcome Jim Waddell to help us in that effort. He's got, as you can see, an esteemed panel of many colleagues across the country. But Jim helps bring higher education institutions together to demonstrate their value to economic and societal growth within their communities and regions. His professional services focus on planning and building partnerships between the institutions and their current and prospective partners in private, civic, and government sectors. He is the president of Jim Waddell and Company, and he's vice president of UEDA. So Jim, as I turn it over to you, I do want to thank you for your leadership in this work as it relates to UEDA, working to release this report, working to convene these ecosystems from across our membership at UEDA, and really looking to learning more about how this is moving into the future. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Tim. And thank you, everybody who's joined us here today for this report out from the really exciting work that we did earlier this year, with many thanks to the Lemelson Foundation for supporting us. I'm going to flip over to share my screen here, and then I'll get started with the presentation. Perhaps over the last year of Zoom meetings and webinars galore, you have heard of a tool called Menti or Mentimeter. We're going to use Menti today as a way to have you join the conversation and interact. I don't remember if Tim mentioned this, but you should definitely use the Zoom tools for Q&A. To ask your questions, and we will take as many questions and bring those into the conversation as we can later. But you can also interact throughout the webinar by going to menti.com, MENTI, and using that code that you see there on the screen, 4675485. You can do that in another window on your computer, or you can open that website on your phone, and you'll be able to chime in on some questions that we have for all of you as we go along. We are really excited to release this report. All of my colleagues that are here with me today, the report represents all of their hard work, as well as nearly actually 100 organizations that partner with UEDA members in their ecosystems. As I mentioned, I'm very grateful to Rachel Jagoda Burnett, who's here from the Lemelson Foundation, and to the Lemelson Foundation for supporting this work. What we did was we said to Rachel last year, what if we could apply design thinking principles to ecosystem building and help our members really think about ecosystems, entrepreneurial ecosystems, and more broadly, economic development ecosystems. And of course, for the Lemelson Foundation, at the heart of that is invention. And they liked our idea, so that's exactly what we did, was we set out to apply design thinking principles to ecosystem building. So we're going to tell you a little bit today about how that worked. Speaking of the Lemelson Foundation, seems like I did not manage to get your name on here, Rachel, but we do have Rachel from the Lemelson Foundation here with us. I apologize for that. And we also have 8 of my colleagues from UEDA member institutions to tell you a little bit. Unfortunately, because there's so many of them, we're only going to get to hear a little bit from each one about their experience with the Ecosystems Design Network and some of the lessons that we learned through the pilot that we did. To get us started, I'd like for all of you who are participating with us today, if you've pulled up that Menti page, you should see a question about what organizations are in your ecosystem. You don't have to give us specific names of organizations, but maybe you could give us a sense of the kinds of organizations that are in your invention and entrepreneurship and more broadly economic development ecosystems. Are they community colleges? Are they economic development organizations? Are they chambers of commerce? Who else? Accelerators, incubators, and so forth. We'd love to see the kinds of organizations that you all are working with in your own ecosystems. And we'll leave that slide up for a couple of minutes here. The first thing we'd like to talk about, the reason we're asking this question is because the first thing we'd like to talk about is what we learned about with regard to roles in ecosystems. You know, when we proposed this work to Rachel and the Lemelson Foundation, the response was partly, you know, we're very interested because we've been doing some work looking at the roles that different organizations play in ecosystems, and we'd really like to get the perspective of higher education institutions on that work. So I'm going to talk a little bit more in a couple of minutes about some of our specific findings about roles, but to sort of set the stage for that conversation about the roles in ecosystems, Rachel, I'd love it if you wouldn't mind just saying a few words about the work that Lemelson Foundation did focused on roles in ecosystems and why you think it's important that we should pay attention to the roles that different organizations play.
Thanks, Jim, and I will try to be really quick so that we can get to the heart of the discussion. As Jim mentioned, I'm Rachel Jagoda Brunette. I'm with the Lemelson Foundation out of Portland, Oregon. I work on our regional ecosystem work, which is what brings me here today. A couple of years ago, we started to look at how we could scale the impact of some of the groups that we had been working with that provided direct service to K-12 and higher ed and other people and businesses within broadly the invention sector, and started to understand in talking with our partners that it was really about more than just getting philanthropic funding to great programs, and rather about creating environments that were supportive of both individuals who are either prospective inventors or entrepreneurs or incumbent inventors and entrepreneurs and their businesses to help them succeed in the communities where they were. We started looking into work that was going on in ecosystems, and I just found so much of it was about networks, which is great on its face. You want connectivity between all these groups, but then I asked the question, what does that mean, connectivity? Is it just a matter of knowing each other, being aware that the other one exists? And so we sought to really bring some meaning to the connectivity that so many other ecosystem models really highlight, which is how we got to this idea of roles. And so what we discovered is that independent of geography, whether you're in the US, in developing countries in the global South, in Europe, the West Coast, the East Coast, anywhere in between, there are a set of roles or capacities that need to be filled in order to have a productive and equitable and inclusive invention ecosystem, or really ecosystem writ large. And so we did quite a bit of work over a couple of years to start defining those. And then again, we're asked the question, so now that we know the roles that we play, how do we actually do this? And that's what brought us to this work with UEDA. Universities were often playing a lot of different roles just because of the size and the presence they had in communities. And so we felt it was really important to start digging down into what universities could do in order to improve their relationships with their ecosystem, which brought us to this project today that UEDA has been such a fantastic leader in, starting to look at how universities engage and what kind of practices they can adopt in order to better serve their ecosystems. And so unless there are any other topics you want me to cover, I will turn it back over to Jim.
Well, that's great, Rachel. Thank you very much for that framing and for the background and the way it's nice to hear that the roles work for the Lemelson Foundation really emerged from the question around connectivity, because that's certainly what we were looking to explore in depth, was really not just the roles that organizations play, but how they're connected and how they develop the connection between not just the organizations and individuals, but also the actual roles that they are playing. So let me, this is great, by the way. Thank you for contributing to this word cloud. As we can see, ecosystems have a whole lot of different kinds of organizations that are part of them. And thank you for sharing the organizations that you're connected with. I would say that, just kind of taking a quick look at what you all have shared, this very much reflects the diversity of ecosystems that were represented in the pilot work that we did. Let me share with you first just some of the learnings that we had about the different roles in ecosystems. Rachel mentioned that one of the things that the Lemelson Foundation had observed is that institutions of higher education were playing many, many different kinds of roles in ecosystems. And I know that when I've had conversations with Rachel about this, sometimes that's good, but sometimes it's a factor or a result of universities kind of wanting to try to do it all. And one of the things that I think we tried to zero in on while we did this work was understanding what are the roles that institutions should be playing and how do those interact with the roles that are out there in the community already. By the way, I do want to mention that if we haven't gotten it there yet, we'll make sure that we have a link to the report that the Lemelson Foundation did that led to our work. So we'll be sharing with you later in the webinar here the link to the report that we are releasing today from UEDA, but we'll also make sure that we include in that webpage from UEDA a link to the Lemelson report, which we might need to get from you, Rachel. So pop that into the chat window to Tim maybe. So here are some of the things that we learned about the roles. First of all, that universities played or contributed to many different roles, not a surprise. We did find it interesting that using the Lemelson Foundation sort of framework for these different roles, when we looked at these 10 ecosystems that we worked closely with, most of them basically said they were complete in terms of having representation of all of the different kinds of things that the Lemelson Foundation had identified as roles. The economic development roles, which was kind of a lens that UEDA brought to this, those were really important in the conversations among UEDA members. Again, not surprisingly, because many of them are playing a broader economic development role at their institution, not always solely focused on innovation and entrepreneurship. The talent development roles in ecosystems were being played not just by our members, many of which are sort of regional comprehensive universities, and some research universities as well, but also community colleges and others across higher ed sectors. So talent development is something that's being undertaken by all kinds of higher ed institutions in our members' ecosystems, but also by other kinds of learning providers. We also found that the institutional mission plays a role in terms of how the institution engages in their ecosystem. So for example, and in particular around invention, innovation, and entrepreneurship, as you might imagine, big research universities that are also IP rich, they're playing a different kind of role in innovation and entrepreneurship ecosystems than, say, regional comprehensive institutions or community colleges, where the roles around invention, entrepreneurship, and innovation are going to be slightly different. And finally, I think one of the biggest things that we learned through the work with these 10 ecosystems is that one role that's not on the Lemelson framework, and that maybe nobody really talks about when they're talking about all of the different kinds of roles in an ecosystem, is the actual ecosystem building itself. Now we know, for example, our friends at the Kauffman Foundation have talked a lot about being ecosystem builders, what it takes to be an ecosystem builder, and what that role is. And that's really important work, because what we found out was that, we're kind of laying out all of these different roles that organizations have. We need to make sure that we're clear about who the ecosystem builder or builders are. And those builders can be individuals. They can also be organizations playing a facilitating kind of role. We've got lots more in the report about roles, so I do want to go ahead and get on to our next topic. But I encourage you to continue to explore what we learned about the roles. Actually, I'm sorry, I do have a couple perspectives on roles that I wanted to bring into the conversation right now. One thing that I mentioned that was really clear was that our institutions play these different roles. And then as I kind of wrapped up there, I was mentioning how ecosystem building itself, it was a role that people identified. I wanted to ask three of my colleagues, Eddie Pauline from BioOhio now, formerly from Ohio State University, Stephanie Pierce from Kansas State University, and Tricia Bergman from University of Kansas. I'm wondering if, in that order, Eddie, Stephanie, and Tricia, you might say a few words about how these findings about roles that we discovered played out in your own work in Columbus, Ohio, Manhattan, Kansas, and Lawrence, Kansas. So Eddie, starting with you.
Sure, thanks, Jim. And, I have to say, leaving higher education and moving into the bioscience space in Ohio, these ecosystem rules and roles are as prevalent and relevant there as they were in higher ed. So I'm looking forward to applying a lot of what we did through our previous process into this new space. In terms of the roles, I think what I noticed was a lot of light bulbs going off with the ecosystem participants. I think many of them knew that they played a lot of different roles within the ecosystem, but getting them to take a minute and reflect on which roles they were sort of unique or superior at was helpful in just clarifying what they could contribute. So going through the participants, getting them to sort of decide and prioritize what role would be best, I think will ultimately help us create an even healthier ecosystem as that clarity comes out and people communicate more about specific contributions that they can make.
That's great. Thanks, Eder. Yeah. A lot of times the focus is on the project, the building of the ecosystem, or the specific activity that the ecosystem is doing. And sometimes people just don't take time to reflect on these roles and think about, well, is the right organization playing this role or that? So thank you. Stephanie, how about in Manhattan? How did these learnings about roles play out there?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. This was definitely a timely process to go through this ecosystem design network, because that entrepreneurship and innovation is very much a priority in the community right now. So we brought together not only university partners, but partners in the community and the whole entrepreneurial ecosystem in our region to go through this process. So it was really, I think, having that light bulb moment is a great way to explain it, because we collaborate together and we work on certain projects, but we don't always know every piece of role that everyone touches. So being able to have that out on paper to where you're seeing where there's those areas that multiple folks are working on, or even to show where there are gaps where we might only have one resource and we need to further develop a role in order to complete the ecosystem, was very eye-opening.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. And then now turning to your neighbors across the state there, Tricia, we'd love to hear from you as well about how these learnings about roles played out there in Lawrence and in the broader, I forget the county name, but I know that you worked with partners across the county in the work that you were doing there at the University of Kansas.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I think what we learned back in the fall, and again, like Stephanie, it was very timely because we were beginning to think about this, beginning to conceptualize what does an ecosystem look like. And I think what we heard was these things are complex environments. These are not simple environments. And then an organization can play such a variety of roles that intersect with the environment at different points. And I think of it as a continuum. So they might intersect at the beginning, but they also can intersect at the end. And you need to be able to conceptualize both of those interactions. What we've done since is within Douglas County, for Jim, within Douglas County, we have a grassroots effort. And so we've got folks from the chamber, we've got entrepreneurs, we've got folks from KU and our innovation park and from our tech school. And we're all beginning to try to develop the ecosystem very much at a grassroots level, where it's just this group of people who are interested and are coming together. And then we have monthly meetings where the larger groups come together and we're listening to the folks in the audience say, what are the problems? And then trying to understand from them, where are the gaps? Where do we have strength? What do we need to work on? Most importantly, getting them to then engage with us and become part of the solution as opposed to just sitting on the side. So it's a great process.
Yeah, well, fantastic. Thank you. And we're going to talk a little bit now about the process. So that's really a great segue, Tricia, because you talked about this sort of grassroots way in which the ecosystem is coming up there in Lawrence and Douglas County. And that's probably the way the strongest ecosystems come together, right? And we found that the design thinking approach was actually really helpful for doing ecosystem building work in that way because of those very things, starting with where the problems are, understanding what the challenges are across the ecosystem and working from there. So we started with that, and here's another opportunity for you to chime in, but we started with that assumption that design thinking would be helpful because we know that in ecosystems, there's a lot of shifting and adapting and iterating that needs to happen as the ecosystem identifies solutions and ideas. And so we'd love to hear from you about the kinds of things that create that need for shifting and adapting and iterating. One thing we talk about all the time with institutions of higher education is leadership changes. they happen all the time, and it's a sort of a constant challenge to sort of keep up with the current leadership and make sure that what's being done at the institution and in its partnerships with external stakeholders really reflects kind of the current vision and the work that the leadership is pushing in the direction of. So I'd love for you to share those here. I think I can go on to the next slide and you'll still be able to respond to some questions. We'll come back to your responses in just a minute. But let's talk a little bit more about design thinking and ecosystems and what we learned about that. You know, we found that this was a helpful way to approach ecosystem building because it was a way that directly connected with the beneficiaries of the ecosystem. Now, of course, there are many beneficiaries of our ecosystems. Many of them are actually participants in the ecosystem, but then there are a lot of people in our communities that benefit from the fact that there is an ecosystem in place. And we really challenged the ecosystems that we worked with to get to know those beneficiaries. So we asked all of our ecosystems who participated in this pilot, go out and talk to the people that are in your ecosystem, or the people who should be in your ecosystem, or the people who are benefiting from your ecosystem, and try to get an understanding of where they see the challenges and where the problems are. So we did that, we ideated, and then we talked a lot sort of towards the end of our pilot about how continually applying design thinking can really help the ecosystem be iterative, adaptive, and responsive to needs in an ongoing way. So to talk a little bit about the benefits of the design thinking process, I'd like to ask a few more of my colleagues to chime in. Hallie Newport from Oregon Institute of Technology, Sharon Painter from East Carolina University, and Suzanne Hallman from Georgia Southern University. Again, folks, in that order, Hallie, Sharon, and Suzanne, could you describe the ways in which the design thinking approach was helpful in your ecosystem work in Klamath Falls, Oregon, in Pitt County, North Carolina, and in rural and coastal Georgia? Starting with you, Hallie.
Great, thank you, Jim. I think what was really helpful for us and kind of eye-opening with this process, as Jim said, we felt like we had a really well-defined ecosystem already. And when those organizations that are already part of the ecosystem went out and started talking to the users of our ecosystem, and then came back and shared our learnings as part of this pilot program, what we quickly learned is those of us in the ecosystem, we have our own lingo. We understood what we were doing. We understood why we were doing it. But those who we were trying to benefit, the users of our ecosystem, primarily the entrepreneurs in our small rural community, they didn't see it. They couldn't see it, and they didn't really understand what or how the ecosystem was intended to support them. So this process really brought those of us who are in the ecosystem together. It let us talk through perhaps the differences that we had been using in terms of communication and language, so that we could define the problem in a way that we all understood it. And that then led us to basically go out and approach those users of our ecosystem in a way that perhaps would present to them a more cohesive unit that they could better connect with.
I love that. You know, that, and by the way, Hallie, what you all discovered around communication, I'd say 201, what we heard from each of our ecosystems was, you know, communication is kind of central to this, and finding out the best ways for us to communicate across the ecosystem, to have sort of a shared language for the work that we're doing. Another benefit for the design thinking, by the way, that we heard was it creates sort of shared language across different kinds of organizations. Thank you so much, Hallie. Sharon, how about you, and how about in Pitt County? How did the design thinking approach help in your ecosystem building?
So I think one of the things that Hallie just said is they've found a common language. It's important in our experience as well. One of the challenges that I suspect many communities go through is that politics get in the way of a lot of things, and we start talking about different priorities based on different stakeholder groups, and sometimes all of the acronyms and all of the things make us lose sight of what we're actually trying to do. And so design thinking gave our group an opportunity to stop and to first ideate about what we're trying to achieve as a community and as a region. And to then come to a common understanding for what that foundational strategic objective is, and then to move toward those operational implementation stages in a planned way. And as we did that, it allowed us to deal with leadership shifts, political agendas, folks, resource changes, all the things that have happened during COVID, in a way that kept us focused on, we're attempting to try a regional strategy, and everybody has a different lane, but all the lanes are on the same highway. And I felt like our conversations were really important for helping to bring us together as a cohesive strategic group. A result from that is that, we identified workforce challenges or something. Just getting people to apply for the jobs is an issue that we've got to address. And as we're doing that in October, our ecosystem's having a regional career and resource fair with planned for 130 employers to show up for adult learners, and estimating we've got 39,000 of those folks in our region that we're trying to match with career pathways, not just a job. And so that conversation has been really fruitful, even in a tangible short-term way. So I think those were some real benefits of design thinking.
That's great. And one of the things I heard you talking about, Sharon, was sort of this ability to bring both a strategic perspective and also real on the ground kind of tactical things to do, which really kept people engaged. And we heard that across our ecosystems that participated. Suzanne, we'd love to hear from you about ecosystem building in rural and coastal Georgia, where a number of us will be come mid-September, as long as you're going to keep us all safe there, Suzanne, make sure that we have all of the protections in place that we need in this kind of crazy time. But thank you, by the way, Suzanne, to Georgia Southern University for hosting us for our annual summit coming up soon.
We're very excited to host all of you. And as far as, the politics and everything are concerned, yes, just everyone is strongly encouraged to, get a vaccine and wear a mask. So we're kind of in that, you got to protect yourself stage of things here, but we are excited to be hosting, and we are excited to have everybody come down to Savannah. So I'm actually located in Statesboro, Georgia, which is about 45 minutes out of Savannah. So we really use that design thinking to take a step back and say, yes, who are the major players across this rural ecosystem, since we're kind of the largest institution of higher ed south of Atlanta. We're trying to see how we can really bring together everyone in our coastal Georgia region because of the assets that we have in our area, like the Georgia Ports Authority. And really what that's led to is thinking about how we can touch specific industries. So a lot of the tech, a lot of the high tech, I guess, innovative and funding kind of flows through Atlanta, right? So how do we try to get things down here on the coast and in the rural areas? And what's really kind of shine for us is being able to say, okay, well, if we have, an incubator or a certain tech center that's focused on ag, and then if we have another center that's focused on logistics, and then who are the different people that are good across the region in different areas. So we've talked with like the College of Coastal Georgia about their strong mentoring program and strong mentors that they have down that way. So as we look at who the players are, and then how can we connect, that technology platform piece, to connect everybody is kind of a glaring, okay, well, what's going to work, what's not. But I would say the biggest challenge we have is just not taking enough risk or thinking as far outside of the box as maybe we would like to when it comes to ideation. We're just so, we're so constrained by our history and just some of the things whether it's politics, whether it's leadership or whatever. Oh, well, that's not going to work. That's not going to work. So how can we constantly pivot around what's not going to work, or let those things go to really think wildly, to come up with ideas and solutions?
That's great. And I'm glad you brought up the whole platform issue, Suzanne. I mean, you know, we heard this also across ecosystems, that having tools to help us better communicate and be connected is really important. But I've also had additional conversations with, well, I'm not sure this even shows up in the report, but I've had conversations with folks in our pilot, but in many other kind of ecosystem contexts as well, about the fact that the platform is only one piece of it, right? That there's you know, a cultural issue or a kind of socializing kind of activity that needs to happen to help members of the ecosystem just be good connectors, whether they've got the tools available or not. You know, they've got to be good connectors. And I think that one of the things that, you know, we kind of saw with the design thinking is that, again, it created a context in which people were open. The idea was to share ideas. The idea was to try out different kinds of thinking. And that, I think, kind of helped to create that, a little bit anyway, of that environment of being connectors. So these are some of the things that we learned, just to wrap up the design thinking piece real quick. We learned that the design thinking facilitated integration with other work that institutions were doing. We've heard this a couple of times, helping to move past the same old things that this tried and true solutions, or sometimes the tried and failed solutions that we've done in the past. The combination of both strategic and tactical, greasing the skids for conversations with partners was an important outcome of using the design thinking approach. Developing that common language we heard mentioned a couple of times, and then helping to focus and prioritize. I mean, there's so many different things that ecosystems should be pursuing. The design thinking approach really kind of brought a discipline to thinking about, well, how do we kind of converge on some ideas that are going to be of most benefit to our ecosystem. So as we move into the last part of our conversation here, first of all, I'd like to remind you to use that Q&A tool to ask any questions of our panel. We are going to have time to share some of your questions with the panel and talk through them. And what I'd like to do now is move into the sort of the last main topic that we're focused on here, which is going to be about how equity and inclusion play a role in our thinking about ecosystems. And that certainly is one of the challenges, again, that we heard all of our ecosystems sort of grappling with, particularly over the last year with not only COVID, but all of the kind of bringing to light and helping people better understand kind of racial and other kinds of social injustices. And so that became an important thread in our conversation. That was one challenge that our ecosystems face. We were going to talk specifically about that one, but we'd love to hear from all of you now about what kind of specific challenges you're facing in designing and building entrepreneurial and economic development ecosystems. And again, I'm going to click ahead here in my slides, but we'll come back to this to see what some of your responses are in just a second. So we'd like to focus for a minute on equity and inclusion. And we use those two words. We've been using those two words in our work, but I would also like to bring in the words access, belonging, and diversity. You know, one of the things I've learned, I think, over the last year when it comes to social justice and related kinds of issues is that there are many different words and we use them interchangeably, and we really shouldn't, because they all mean really different and important things. And it's really important for us to get clear about that. And at this moment, I'd like to just give a shout out to our friends at Forward Cities, an organization that's done a lot of work with ecosystems and focused on equity and inclusion, and also access, belonging, and diversity. And in fact, their framework that they share with the ecosystems they work with is called ABIDE, combining access, belonging, inclusion, diversity, and equity. So just Google Forward Cities and ABIDE, and you'll learn a bit about their perspective on that. I will say that our findings in the project overall did not go deep on equity and inclusion. I think what we found out was oh my gosh, we have all these other things that we need to talk about in this short time that we have for this pilot. And we really did not have an opportunity to go deep on these issues. But of course, these are incredibly important topics to address in ecosystem design and ecosystem building. And I know I had conversations with a number of our ecosystems, even though this didn't kind of become a formal part of our findings, about the issues of equity and inclusion. And it's certainly part of our recommendations in this report that, you know, as part of your ecosystem building, you need to be focused on these things. Two folks that were part of our pilot that I remember having conversations with about in particular were George Ward from the University of Kentucky and Saleha Kumwala from the University of Houston. Again, George and Saleha, I know that equity and inclusion have been central to the work that you've been doing in ecosystem building across Kentucky, in your case, George, and in Houston, Texas, in yours, Saleha. And I'm just wondering if, again, in that order, George and then Saleha, could you talk to us a little bit about what you've learned about the importance of these issues, equity, inclusion, access, belonging, diversity, and any of the other words that you're focused on? George, can you tell us about your experience with these issues in Kentucky?
Yeah, sure, Jim. You know, the importance of equitable economic development was highlighted in the breakout sessions during the UEDA virtual conference last year, and was further highlighted when we got back together again with our local economic development ecosystem. One of the groups that was interviewed in the ecosystem design work was the Lexington Urban League, and they really pointed out, you know, the need for job training, wellness, childcare, affordable housing, all of this to build the local workforce. So at the same time, and Jim was mentioning this, you know, diversity, equity, inclusion, you know, access, belonging, you know, all these terms, you know, were becoming strategic priorities, you know, in the past few years for all types of organizations, whether it be government, academia, or industry. So all this inspired a couple of activities at UK. One, we have an organization, we call it the UK Economic Development Collaborative. And, you know, we focus on talent, innovation, and place, and we have subcommittees in each of those categories. So we added another subcommittee for equitable economic development. And UK also created a pretty big effort for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And one of the activities I was involved with was creating a community advisory group. So what we've learned so far is you need a big table. You have to listen to the community's needs and have as many populations represented as possible. And when you have broad-based collaboration, it's most beneficial with the more diverse group input that you have and the more opinions that you receive. You need to listen to the needs of the community you're serving. You can't be, you know, the university here has come to save you, you know, with our own ideas. So you have to listen to the needs of the community and respond to those in a way that the community wants you to respond in. You know, the needs are many, the resources are limited, like everything that we do. So you have to prioritize that work. The action that you take has to be sustainable. You know, it needs to be able to stand through changes in administrations, which Jim talked about a few minutes ago, changes in personnel. The activity needs to be, you know, needs to have a sustainable funding source. And then activities need to be measurable, like, you know, everything that we do. So what we hope to do is to create and use equity mapping to establish benchmarks, identify gaps and opportunities, and then measure changes when resources are committed to certain neighborhoods or certain communities. And also as a way to hold, you know, various agencies that are working with these communities accountable. UK is going to facilitate a workshop at the UEDA Summit in a few weeks, and it's going to be to build a menu of equitable economic development activities that can be used at other universities. So we're going to use a couple of the themes that UK is working on, the equity mapping, and then another one are using grow your own practices for recruitment, retention, and relationships. And then we're going to ask the attendees of the workshop and crowdsource their ideas and try to work through those so that we can end up with a nice menu that any university could use and choose various activities to improve diversity, equity, inclusion, and equitable economic development activities in their communities.
That's great. Thank you so much, George. You clearly all are tackling these issues of equity and inclusion head on there in Kentucky. And thanks for sharing some of the things that you're doing. And what about you, Soleha? What about in Houston? What kinds of things are you finding are important with regard to equity and inclusion in your ecosystem building? Are you still there, Soleha? Maybe you're on mute.
Yes, sorry, I was on mute. Okay, thank you, Jim. Thank you, Lemelson Foundation, for this opportunity. We were thrilled to be part of this project. Yes, so if you see my background, the SURE, it stands for Stimulating Urban Renewal Through Entrepreneurship. It's a program we have had at the University of Houston that I developed and it has been in existence for 6 years now, 7 years. And diversity, inclusion, equity, and economic empowerment have been the cornerstones of our program. Okay. And being in Houston, as you can imagine, you know, the gap between the haves and the have-nots is huge. Our gap is about the national average. And in terms of the numbers that you see in our program, you know, 67% of the under-resourced entrepreneurs that go through our program are below the HUD level, HUD threshold of low income. So okay, so we have been serving them, but then what happened? Okay, we had COVID, we had the pandemic and all of that. How did we address this acute need to these under-resourced entrepreneurs, especially in this time of crisis? As we all know, that this sector of the population was disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. Okay, if you talk about access to capital, they had no access. They had very little access to begin with. Then you say, well, what about PPP? What about EIDL? Well, no, 1,400 under-resourced entrepreneurs were crying that went through our program. And I literally told the SBA, the money is not trickling down. So what did we do then? You know, that's the thing. What have we done to correct that or help? I wouldn't say correct it. You can correct a major problem, but at least alleviate where you are. So we established a SURE CDFI, a community development financial institution. And when you establish so that these under-resourced entrepreneurs will have access to those microloans that the formal financial institutions do not give them, so that at least they have something to get them going. We got seed grants for them, grants, not even loans, from our funding partners. We went to our funding partners and we said, this is what we need. We need grant money to give them. Wells Fargo, Bank of America, and several of our funding partners gave us grant money to give them. And then the CDFI gives them access to microloans. Something else that I did this summer, and that's yet to be seen, but I don't know how many of you have done this, but the SBA came out with this new Community Navigators pilot program. And we applied for that $2.5 million grant as a hub. And we took 7 of our ecosystem partners in Houston and made them as spokes. We couldn't even take everybody that wanted to be part of it because we just couldn't handle it. But then we had several other ecosystem partners also apply. So this way we could get access to capital and really, you know, not correct it again, as I hate to use that word correct, but at least alleviate some of the challenges that these under-resourced, you know, are facing.
Yeah.
So, you know, we brought the SBA into the picture. We brought governmental entities, our city, and our governor into the picture. He said, you need to come, you need to help, you need to work with us. We also built an ecosystem alliance. So an ecosystem alliance for minority and women entrepreneurs. And that alliance of all the ecosystem in Houston, we're all now partners and we are players and we are working together. And one of the things that George mentioned, you know, So this is part of our curriculum. The SURE program, the courses that students take, it's built into the curriculum. So it's not going. You have a change in deanship, you have a change in administration. This is embedded in the curriculum. Okay, that's one thing. The other thing is we also have in Texas, and I'm sure in most states, our financial institutions have to give back under the CRA. So the Community Reinvestment Act. So we get funding from that. So you get, George identified funding source. Well, we have a steady stream of funding from these banks because banks cannot reach that population that you and I can. And therefore they're happy to give us the funding.
So
It's built into the curriculum and we get the source of funding. And then with all of this, we have continued to do it. So thank you.
Making some incredible connections there in Houston. And thank you for sharing those because it sounds like many of them are very relevant to the regions that our other participants are in. Thank you so much, Saleha. I really appreciate that. And thank you to all of our panelists from the ecosystems that participated in our pilot. We are gonna get to a few questions. I'm wondering about the time because Tim, I was all ready to end at 3 o'clock and then I think I saw somewhere that this went to 3:15, but you'll have to give me guidance on that. We may have to, what's that?
3 o'clock is the end time.
3 o'clock is the end. Okay, so we're going to rush through this last bit here. I just wanted to quickly say in our last topic that, UEDA, as is outlined in the report, is continuing to focus on ecosystems. A number of our recommendations in the report are about staying engaged in UEDA's efforts on this front. We will be continuing the ecosystems design network and also developing a broader ecosystem strategy for UEDA, including the ecosystem membership that Tim mentioned a little bit earlier. Just quickly before we jump to questions, I just want to say thank you so much to Julia Potter for playing such a big role in shaping all of this work and participating in helping to pull it all together, and also to Jeff Soxie for taking on the leadership of some of UEDA's ecosystems efforts. And of course, thank you to Tim and all of the folks that he brings to the table to help get all of this great work done. There's much more to say about ecosystems. I hope we can get a chance to see you at the summit in Savannah to tell you more, but let's try to squeeze in at least one question if we can before we go. Tim, I know that not a lot has shown up in the Q&A module, but I did see a couple in the chat. I don't know if you saw those questions.
Yeah, one question is, what are some of the biggest gaps that some of the ecosystems found, like gaps in funding, venture capital, talent, organizations, roles, some things that were commonly missed?
Yeah, so what was missing in your ecosystems? When we started this work, the first session that we did, we asked institutions and their ecosystems to talk about what was missing in terms of roles, and we learned a little bit about that and shared that in the report. But I'm just going to throw it out there for any of our ecosystem participants to chime in. What did you find were gaps as you did this work, or as you're doing it now?
I can kick it off in talking to our 100 people who have attended our 2 meetings. The biggest gap, which surprised us, is they just don't know the resources. So they don't even know what's out there and then how to access it. And we all expected funding to be right up there at the top. But I think right now, the biggest issue for us to address literally is what are the resources and where do they exist and how do they tap into them?
Thank you so much, Tricia. What other gaps did people discover?
I think what I would add to that, and I'm in a small town, it's time, to be honest. We have a lot of organizations, but those organizations have 1 or 2 people in them. And to be able to devote the time needed to really advance this in a way that's meaningful it's challenging when there's, especially during COVID, when there's so many other priorities out there right now.
Yeah, bandwidth. We hear that all the time. One more, how about one more gap before we turn our attention, unfortunately, to wrapping up?
Jim, I'll add on to what was just said. And, one of the things that we found in Kentucky is, you need to have somebody to lead it. And I didn't want the University of Kentucky to have to be the leader of it. And so, we did run into that time issue. And, since that time, with some of the partnership projects that we're working on, we've said, if we're going to do this right, we have to hire a project manager to take on, whatever that specific project is. And then I think the other thing, and it's probably pretty obvious to a lot of people in the Midwest, is venture funding. And so, we do our best to try to stand up our own funds, and hopefully you'll hear more from Kentucky on that in the not too distant future.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you, all of you, for sharing those gaps. This is a tremendous group that can serve as a resource for any of you who've attended the webinar today. I'm just going to say quickly, thank you to all of the folks here, the folks who participated in our pilot. Again, many thanks to Rachel and the Lemelson Foundation, and thanks to all of you who attended the webinar today. I noticed that Tim has posted a link to the report, so it is officially released now, and we welcome you to check out that report. And I think Tim has a few more action items for everybody. So I'm going to turn it back over to Tim. Thanks again, everybody.
Thanks, Jim, and thank you, panel. Really appreciate everyone's participation in the EDN as well as the webinar today. I did post the report in the chat. We're also going to be emailing that out broadly later on this afternoon. Don't forget to register your ecosystem if you haven't done so already by visiting our ecosystems page. If you'd like to consider a membership as an ecosystem, it's a great way to converge together as an ecosystem under one common purpose. And conveniently enough, our membership chair is also Jim Waddell. So everyone knows our membership chair at UEDA, and you know me now too. So if you have any questions about membership, please feel free to reach out to either of us. Jim mentioned our summit. We're thrilled to be in Savannah with Suzanne and Dominic and everyone else from Georgia Southern. That's happening September 19th to the 21st. There is, we have been able to add content as a result of some other funding that we received from the EDA, and we'll be launching a major program here in the coming months. But we are having on Sunday an economic accelerator day that's focused strictly on economic resiliency, economic equity, and university centers. So we encourage you to join us for that. EDA will be participating in that. That's a separate registration from the summit. So if you've registered for the summit, that doesn't necessarily mean you're registered for the economic accelerator. So to keep that in mind, our summit has a lot of great workshops, a lot of best practices. Some of the workshops around ecosystems are funding resilient ecosystems. It takes more than a village, statewide strategies to leverage higher education for economic transformation, entrepreneurial ecosystem building, and you heard some of those referenced in today's conversation. So please make sure that you consider joining us at the summit. To participate, summit.universityeda.org, and we hope to see you there. Otherwise, that's it for today. Thank you for joining us, and look forward to seeing you all at the summit or at our next webinar.
Thank you, everyone.